Sign it now, Eleanor. Your mother is gone, and I'm done pretending this marriage still exists." Those were the first words Nathaniel Pierce spoke while the last handful of earth settled onto his mother-in-law's casket. For a heartbeat, Eleanor Brooks wondered if grief had distorted reality, if exhaustion from 7 months of pregnancy had twisted sound into something impossible. But when she looked up, her millionaire husband wasn't standing beside her to offer comfort. He stood several feet away in a tailored black suit with a divorce attorney holding a leather portfolio, waiting as if this cemetery were nothing more than another boardroom. The cold November wind carried the scent of fresh rain across the hillside outside Hartford, Connecticut, lifting strands of Eleanor's dark hair as she instinctively rested one trembling hand over her unborn daughter's gentle movement. Her mother had been buried less than 60 seconds ago. Nathaniel wanted her signature before the flowers had even settled. If you think this story is about a rich man abandoning his pregnant wife at the lowest point of her life, you're only seeing the surface. Because hidden beneath the silence of that funeral was a secret worth $900 million, a secret Nathaniel couldn't have imagined, and one that would quietly rewrite every decision he believed he controlled. Eleanor stared at the familiar face she had once trusted more than anyone. The sharp blue eyes, the perfect posture, the polished confidence that had once inspired her now felt strangely hollow. There was no anger in his expression. That would have required emotion. Instead, there was only calculation, the detached focus of a man closing an unprofitable investment. "This doesn't have to be ugly," Nathaniel said, extending a fountain pen toward her as though offering a courtesy. "We've both known this was over for months." Around them, mourners exchanged uncertain glances. No one interrupted. Funerals had a way of freezing people into quiet witnesses, unsure whether compassion or distance was the kinder choice. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the papers. Her own name appeared neatly printed beside a blank signature line. The ink seemed darker against the white page than anything else she could see. Somewhere behind her, the church bell rang once, its echo stretching across rows of marble headstones. Then her phone vibrated inside her coat pocket. She ignored it. Seconds later, it vibrated again. Nathaniel mistook the distraction for hesitation. "You don't need to drag this out," he said calmly. "The house stays with me. The company stays with me. My attorneys have made everything very fair." Fair. The word lingered in Eleanor's mind like a bitter taste. Fair had once meant skipping vacations so Nathaniel could invest another $50,000 into his first development project. Fair had meant selling family jewelry to help cover payroll during his hardest year. Fair had meant believing promises whispered across a tiny apartment before success changed the language of love into contracts, percentages, and exit strategies. Her phone vibrated a third time. This time the screen briefly illuminated through the fabric of her coat. A single notification appeared before fading away. It came from Harrison and Cole estate attorneys. Urgent. Confidential. Eleanor never opened it. Not yet. She simply looked back at Nathaniel, whose confidence rested on one assumption so complete, so absolute, that he never questioned it. He believed she was walking away from that cemetery completely alone. He had no idea that before the sun would set, the entire balance of power between them would quietly, permanently, and irrevocably change. Eleanor did not reach for the phone until she was alone in her car. The cemetery had emptied slowly, the last black umbrellas disappearing beyond the iron gates, while cold rain tapped softly against her windshield. She sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her stomach as her daughter shifted again, almost as if sensing every emotion her mother refused to release. 3 missed calls, 2 voice messages, 1 secure email, all from Harrison and Cole estate attorneys. Her heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Her mother had always believed that important news should never be opened in anger. Breathe first, decide second. Eleanor closed her eyes, hearing her mother's calm voice as clearly as if she were sitting in the passenger seat. She opened the email. The first sentence made her forget the divorce papers folded inside her purse. "Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, in accordance with the final will and testament of Margaret Brooks, you are now the sole beneficiary of the Brooks Family Trust." She stared without blinking. There had to be a mistake. Her mother had spent most of her life as a respected art conservator, someone who drove the same modest sedan for 15 years, and insisted on clipping grocery coupons despite having excellent taste in everything she bought. Luxury had never interested Margaret Brooks. Simplicity had. Eleanor continued reading. The trust controlled commercial real estate across 4 states, majority ownership in several technology investment funds, private equity holdings, municipal bonds, and historical properties that had quietly appreciated for decades. Estimated current value, approximately $900 million. Eleanor almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because grief had become so overwhelming that reality itself seemed determined to test her. She immediately called the number at the bottom of the email. A calm voice answered before the second ring. Mrs. Brooks, we have been trying to reach you. First, please accept our deepest condolences. Second, your mother instructed us that this information was never to be disclosed until after her funeral. Eleanor looked back toward the cemetery through sheets of rain. Why would she keep something like this from me? There was a brief pause before the attorney replied. Because she believed wealth reveals character, and she wanted to know who loved you before anyone knew what you owned. Silence settled inside the car. Suddenly, dozens of forgotten memories returned with startling clarity. Her mother declining expensive gifts. Her mother quietly asking careful questions about Nathaniel every Thanksgiving. Her mother smiling politely while never allowing him access to family financial records. At the time, Eleanor had mistaken caution for stubbornness. Now every conversation felt different. Every warning carried new meaning. The attorney continued gently. Mrs. Brooks also left you a handwritten letter. She instructed us to deliver it personally this afternoon. Eleanor swallowed hard. Did she know she was running out of time? I believe mothers often know more than they admit. Eleanor ended the call and rested both hands on the steering wheel. Outside, the clouds began to thin just enough for a pale strip of afternoon light to break across the wet headstones. Meanwhile, less than 10 miles away, Nathaniel walked into the headquarters of Pierce Development believing he had finally removed the last obstacle standing between himself and the future he had already planned. He congratulated himself for handling everything efficiently. He believed Eleanor would sign the documents within days because she had nowhere else to go. He believed the house, the company, and the reputation he had built would remain entirely under his control. He never questioned why Eleanor had looked at him with sadness instead of desperation. He never wondered why she had slipped the unsigned divorce papers back into her purse without saying a single angry word. Most of all, he never imagined that before the week was over, the woman he considered powerless would possess enough influence to reshape the very world where he believed he made all the rules. By the next morning, Eleanor arrived at Harrison and Cole with almost no expectation beyond receiving the letter her mother had promised. The law office occupied the top 2 floors of a restored brick building overlooking the Connecticut River, quiet enough that every ticking clock seemed louder than normal. The receptionist greeted her by name before she even introduced herself, then escorted her into a conference room where 3 attorneys and 2 financial advisors were already waiting. Nobody looked surprised to see her. It was as though they had been preparing for this meeting for years. A silver box rested in the center of the polished walnut table. One attorney, Daniel Harrison, gently slid it toward her. Your mother wanted you to open this first. Eleanor lifted the lid with careful hands. Inside lay a handwritten envelope, a simple gold key, and an old photograph. The picture showed her as a little girl standing beside Margaret in front of a modest lakeside cabin, both of them laughing while covered in paint after restoring an antique canoe. Eleanor smiled through fresh tears. Her mother had never cared about appearances. She had cared about building things that lasted. She unfolded the letter. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I have finally stopped worrying about whether I had enough time to prepare you. I did not hide this family legacy because I doubted you. I hid it because I wanted you to discover who valued your heart before they discovered your balance sheet. Money attracts admiration that often disappears the moment the numbers change. Character never does. Eleanor paused, struggling to steady her breathing. Daniel quietly placed a glass of water beside her, but said nothing. She continued reading. You once asked me why I lived so simply when I could afford more. The answer is easy. Wealth should buy freedom, never identity. Promise me that no matter how much this inheritance grows, you will never measure people by what they own. Measure them by what they protect when nobody is watching. Eleanor folded the letter against her chest. The room remained respectfully silent until Daniel opened a leather portfolio. Mrs. Brooks, there is one additional instruction. Your mother established a 72-hour confidentiality period. During that time, no public filings, ownership transfers, or financial disclosures will be released. Legally, only everyone in this room knows the trust has transferred. Eleanor looked up. So Nathaniel has no idea. Daniel slowly shook his head. None whatsoever. Another advisor activated a large screen displaying maps, investment charts, and organizational structures. Eleanor watched as hundreds of properties illuminated across New England, Florida, Colorado, and Texas. There were office towers, medical facilities, renewable energy partnerships, research grants, and charitable foundations carrying names she had never heard before. Her mother had quietly built an empire that almost nobody connected to the Brooks family. This cannot be real, Eleanor whispered. It is, Daniel replied. And beginning today, every major decision requires your approval. At that exact moment, Nathaniel was sitting inside the executive conference room at Pierce Development presenting expansion plans to investors. His confidence filled the room as he outlined an ambitious acquisition strategy for the coming year. He spoke about control, leverage, and timing, completely unaware that several investment firms whose support he considered guaranteed were now indirectly accountable to the woman he had expected to leave with nothing. Across town, Eleanor listened as each advisor carefully explained her new responsibilities. Nobody encouraged revenge. Nobody mentioned Nathaniel. They discussed stewardship, long-term planning, employee pensions, charitable obligations, and preserving the values Margaret Brooks had protected for decades. As the meeting came to a close, Daniel handed Eleanor one final folder marked with a single handwritten instruction from her mother. She opened it slowly and found only one sentence inside. Before you make any decision about your future, ask yourself one question. Does this choice heal your heart, or only satisfy your pride? Eleanor closed the folder without answering. Somewhere deep inside, she already knew the question that mattered even more was whether Nathaniel would recognize the woman he had underestimated before the truth reached everyone else. 2 days after the funeral, Nathaniel requested that Eleanor meet him at the downtown office of his divorce attorneys. The invitation sounded polite enough, but every sentence carried the quiet confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. Eleanor arrived exactly on time, wearing the same Navy maternity coat she had worn to her mother's service. She deliberately chose not to wear expensive jewelry or anything that hinted her life had changed. As she stepped into the reception area, conversations softened for just a moment before returning to business. Nathaniel stood beside the panoramic windows overlooking Hartford, speaking with his attorney while checking messages on his phone. He barely looked up when she entered. "Thank you for coming," he said evenly. "This should not take long." Eleanor took a seat without responding. Her hands rested calmly over the folder she carried, although it contained nothing related to the inheritance. Daniel Harrison had advised her to say as little as possible until the confidentiality period expired. Across the polished conference table, Nathaniel's attorney slid a thick stack of documents toward her. These papers reflect a fair division based on current marital assets. Mr. Pierce will retain Pierce Development, the marital residence, and the investment accounts registered under his name. You will receive a financial settlement along with support arrangements that satisfy state requirements. Eleanor slowly turned each page. Years of marriage had been reduced to paragraphs, signatures, and numbered clauses. She noticed entire categories of business holdings were absent. Several partnerships she remembered discussing over dinner had disappeared from the disclosures altogether. She quietly closed the folder. "Is something incorrect?" the attorney asked. Eleanor looked directly at Nathaniel for the first time since entering the room. "Did you review every page yourself?" Nathaniel leaned back comfortably. "My legal team handled the details. I trust them completely." "So you are confident this agreement reflects everything honestly?" Nathaniel nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely." Eleanor held his gaze for another long second before offering the faintest smile. It was not a smile of victory or bitterness. It was the expression of someone watching another person unknowingly step toward a door that could never be closed again. "Very well," she replied softly. "I wanted to hear you say that." Nathaniel seemed relieved by her calmness. He had expected arguments, tears, perhaps desperate attempts to save the marriage. Instead, he found only quiet acceptance, and he interpreted that silence as surrender. "You are making the right decision," he said. "Dragging this through court would only make things harder for everyone, especially with the baby coming." Eleanor glanced briefly toward the city skyline outside the window. Months earlier, she would have believed those words. She would have convinced herself that keeping peace mattered more than asking difficult questions. But grief had stripped away illusions far more effectively than anger ever could. She reached for the pen lying beside the documents, signed the acknowledgement of receipt, but stopped before the signature page that would finalize the agreement. She carefully returned the pen to the table. "I will have my attorney review everything before I sign the final documents." Nathaniel frowned for the first time that morning. "Your attorney?" "Yes." "Since when do you have separate counsel?" Eleanor answered calmly. "Since I realized important decisions deserve independent advice." A brief silence settled over the room. Nathaniel's attorney exchanged a quick glance with him before collecting the paperwork. "Of course," she said professionally. "Please have your counsel contact our office within the week." Eleanor stood to leave. As she reached the conference room door, Nathaniel spoke again without turning around. "You are going to find that life is much more difficult than you think." Eleanor rested her hand on the door handle. "Perhaps," she answered quietly. "Or perhaps we have both underestimated how quickly life can change." She walked out before either man could reply. Neither Nathaniel nor his attorney noticed that at almost the exact same moment, 3 separate emails had arrived in the inboxes of major investment executives across the Northeast, each requesting confidential meetings authorized by the newly appointed trustee of the Brooks Family Trust. The name attached to every request had not yet reached Nathaniel's desk, but it was already moving steadily in his direction. The 72-hour confidentiality period ended at exactly 9 o'clock Monday morning. Eleanor was standing inside the private office her mother had quietly maintained for years, watching the first rays of sunlight spill across shelves lined with leather-bound journals, property ledgers, and framed photographs of employees whose names she had only begun to learn. The office overlooked the Connecticut River, peaceful enough that it seemed impossible such a place directed an enterprise stretching across half the country. Daniel Harrison entered carrying a slim tablet instead of another stack of legal documents. "It is official now," he said with a respectful smile. "Every transfer has been recorded. Every institution has been notified. The Brooks Family Trust is now under your leadership." Eleanor nodded slowly, but instead of celebrating, she walked toward the large window where her mother's favorite rocking chair still faced the water. She rested one hand on the chair's worn wooden arm and quietly whispered, "I hope I make you proud." Behind her, the room gradually filled with advisors, accountants, investment managers, and foundation directors. None of them treated her like someone who had suddenly become wealthy. They treated her like the steward of a legacy that had been carefully protected for generations. One by one, they introduced themselves, not by titles, but by years of service. 31 years, 24 years, 18 years. Eleanor realized her mother had built something far greater than financial success. She had built loyalty. Daniel activated a presentation on the conference screen. "There is one matter requiring immediate attention," he explained. "Several corporations within the trust own minority positions in regional development funds. Individually, they appear insignificant. Collectively, they influence financing decisions for dozens of commercial projects." Eleanor studied the charts without interrupting. Then one familiar name appeared. "Pierce Development." She looked up. "Explain." Daniel enlarged the diagram. "Your trust does not own Nathaniel's company directly. However, several lending partnerships supporting current expansion projects receive capital through investment vehicles now under your authority." Eleanor remained silent. The room waited. Finally, she spoke. "I do not want anyone punished because of my personal life. Employees should never suffer for decisions made by executives." Several advisors exchanged approving glances. Daniel nodded. "Your mother would have given exactly the same instruction." Eleanor continued. "Review every investment exactly as you would for any other company. If the projects are sound, honor every commitment. If they are weak, follow normal standards. No exceptions, no favors, no revenge." At nearly the same moment, Nathaniel was reviewing quarterly projections inside Pierce Development. His chief financial officer entered carrying a folder with an unusually concerned expression. "We have a small complication," she said. Nathaniel barely looked up from his laptop. "How small?" 3 financing partners requested additional documentation before releasing the next construction funds. Nathaniel frowned. That has never happened before. Apparently, there is new oversight at the investment level. He leaned back confidently. "Fine. Send whatever they need." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes before he dismissed it as routine. Yet across multiple conference rooms in Boston, New York, and Hartford, executives were quietly reviewing every pending agreement involving Pierce Development with fresh attention. Not because anyone had ordered them to target Nathaniel, but because a new trustee had requested every investment under the Brooks Family Trust be evaluated according to stricter long-term standards. That afternoon, Eleanor attended her first foundation board meeting. Instead of discussing profits, the agenda focused on children's hospitals, scholarship programs, housing initiatives, and historic preservation projects funded over decades by anonymous donations. Eleanor listened more than she spoke. By the end of the meeting, one elderly board member smiled warmly and said, "Your mother always believed the strongest people were the ones who never needed the world to know they were strong." Eleanor smiled quietly. She understood those words far better now than she ever could have only a week earlier. As she gathered her notes, her phone vibrated with an incoming email marked urgent. It contained only a single sentence from Daniel Harrison. "Nathaniel Pierce has just requested an emergency meeting with every lender supporting his expansion projects, and none of them are giving him immediate answers." By Wednesday morning, Nathaniel had stopped calling the situation a delay. 3 separate lenders had postponed final approval on projects that only days earlier had been described as routine. Every response sounded almost identical. Additional review. Updated compliance standards. Internal authorization pending. None of the explanations were dramatic, yet together they formed a wall that no amount of confidence seemed able to move. Nathaniel paced across his corner office overlooking downtown Hartford, his phone pressed against his ear as another familiar business contact offered the same careful answer. "I wish I had more information," the executive said politely. "The decision is above my level now." Nathaniel ended the call without hiding his frustration. He turned toward Melissa Grant, his chief financial officer, who stood quietly beside the conference table holding a growing stack of reports. "Someone is coordinating this," he said. "Banks do not suddenly become cautious all at once." Melissa hesitated before answering. "We investigated that possibility. There is no evidence anyone is targeting Pierce Development. Every institution insists they are simply following revised investment oversight." Nathaniel frowned. "Who changed the oversight?" "That is what we have not been able to determine." Across the city, Eleanor sat inside another meeting, though her surroundings could not have been more different. Instead of discussing stalled construction schedules, she was reviewing scholarship applications from first-generation college students. She carefully read each story before approving every recommendation made by the foundation committee. Daniel Harrison watched quietly before sliding another folder toward her. "There is one matter requiring your signature." Eleanor glanced at the document. It authorized continued funding for one of the investment partnerships currently reviewing Nathaniel's expansion proposals. She looked up immediately. "Has their analysis been completed?" "Not yet." "Then nothing changes. Let them finish their work without interference." Daniel smiled faintly. "You continue making this much harder for anyone expecting revenge." Eleanor closed the folder. "My mother spent decades building trust. I am not going to spend 1 week destroying it." Later that afternoon, Nathaniel attended an emergency meeting with several senior executives. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from the confident planning sessions he usually enjoyed. Charts filled the presentation screens, but instead of discussing growth, every graph reflected uncertainty. One executive finally broke the silence. "Our largest mixed-use development cannot move forward unless financing clears by the end of next week." Another added, "Several institutional investors have postponed commitments until the new oversight process concludes." Nathaniel folded his arms. "Then we find out who is behind this process." His legal advisor adjusted his glasses before speaking. "We have traced the reviews to a network of investment partnerships connected through a private trust. Ownership records were updated only days ago." Nathaniel leaned forward. "Whose trust?" The attorney shook his head. The filings identify only a newly appointed trustee. We have submitted formal requests for additional information, but the organizational structure is unusually private. Nathaniel stared through the conference room windows as sunlight reflected off neighboring buildings. Somewhere beyond the glass, someone had quietly acquired enough influence to slow projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars without making a single public statement. For the first time in years, he found himself reacting instead of controlling events. Meanwhile, Eleanor concluded another meeting by approving expanded funding for a children's hospital her mother had supported anonymously for nearly 2 decades. As the board members gathered their papers, one elderly trustee paused beside her. "Leadership is interesting," he said warmly. "Most people think power begins when everyone learns your name. Sometimes real power begins because nobody needs to." Eleanor reflected on those words during the drive home. She had not called reporters. She had not announced her inheritance. She had not contacted Nathaniel once. Yet every decision she made quietly echoed through institutions he had always assumed would remain predictable. That evening, as Nathaniel reviewed one final email before leaving the office, his expression finally changed. A formal invitation had arrived requesting his attendance at a strategic investment review scheduled for Friday morning. The location was familiar: Harrison and Cole Executive Conference Center. The host listed at the bottom of the invitation was one name he had never expected to see in any corporate boardroom: Eleanor Brooks. Friday morning arrived with the kind of quiet that usually came before a major storm, except the skies above Hartford were perfectly clear. Nathaniel stepped out of his car in front of Harrison and Cole Executive Conference Center, wearing the same confidence that had carried him through countless negotiations over the past decade. He convinced himself the invitation had to be a misunderstanding. Perhaps Eleanor needed financial guidance. Perhaps she had hired the wrong advisors. Whatever the explanation, he expected to regain control within minutes. Inside the lobby, polished marble reflected the morning sunlight while executives from banks, investment firms, and pension funds exchanged quiet greetings over coffee. Several faces were immediately familiar to Nathaniel: men and women who had attended charity galas, real estate conferences, and board meetings with him for years. Normally, they greeted him with easy conversation. This morning, they simply nodded politely before returning to private discussions. It was not hostility. Somehow it felt even colder than that. It was distance. A conference assistant approached with a professional smile. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce. Your name badge and meeting materials are ready." Nathaniel accepted the folder without comment. As he opened it, his eyes stopped on the meeting agenda: Strategic Portfolio Review. Chairperson, Eleanor Brooks. Trustee, Brooks Family Trust. He read the line twice before closing the folder again. Impossible. His phone vibrated. Melissa had sent a brief message. "Public ownership records updated at 8:30. You need to see this immediately." Nathaniel opened the attachment. Page after page revealed corporate structures he had never connected before: real estate partnerships, venture funds, regional lenders, infrastructure investments, charitable foundations, each ultimately traced back to one organization: Brooks Family Trust. Estimated managed assets exceeded $900 million. Nathaniel stared at the screen until another attendee politely excused himself while passing through the hallway. The meeting room doors opened. A conference coordinator invited everyone inside. Nathaniel entered slowly, taking his usual seat near the center of the long walnut table. Conversations faded almost instantly. At precisely 9 o'clock, the side doors opened again. Eleanor walked into the room wearing a tailored navy maternity dress beneath a cream-colored blazer. Nothing about her appearance was extravagant. No dramatic jewelry. No attempt to display wealth. Yet the atmosphere shifted the moment she entered. One after another, senior executives stood to greet her. Several crossed the room to shake her hand personally. Others welcomed her back with quiet respect, as though they had known the Brooks family for decades. Nathaniel remained seated, unable to reconcile the woman before him with the version he believed he understood only days earlier. Daniel Harrison stepped forward. "Good morning, everyone. Before we begin today's investment review, I would like to formally recognize Mrs. Eleanor Brooks as the newly appointed trustee and chair of the Brooks Family Trust, effective this week according to the final wishes of Margaret Brooks." The room answered with respectful applause. Eleanor acknowledged the welcome with a simple nod before taking her seat at the head of the table. She did not look toward Nathaniel immediately. Instead, she thanked everyone for attending and spoke briefly about responsible stewardship, long-term investment, employee stability, and community partnerships. Her voice remained calm and measured. Every sentence reflected preparation rather than performance. Nathaniel finally raised his hand. I was not aware Margaret Brooks controlled these assets. Eleanor met his eyes for the first time that morning. Very few people were. Why was this never disclosed? Before Eleanor could answer, Daniel responded professionally. The Brooks Family Trust has always operated privately by design. Confidentiality protected both the family and the organizations it supported. Nathaniel looked back at Eleanor. Questions crowded his thoughts faster than he could ask them. She had never lied to him. She had simply never known the full truth herself until after her mother's passing. That realization settled over him with unexpected weight. The woman he believed had lost everything had actually inherited responsibilities greater than anything he had ever managed. Eleanor opened the first project file on the agenda. The company name on the cover read Pierce Development. She looked around the table before speaking. Let us review this proposal using the same standards we apply to every investment, with fairness, transparency, and without personal bias. In that single sentence, Nathaniel understood something that no balance sheet could measure. Eleanor had entered the room with every opportunity to humiliate him publicly, yet she had chosen something far more powerful. She had chosen integrity. The review lasted nearly 4 hours, yet not once did Eleanor allow personal history to enter the discussion. Every proposal presented to the board received the same careful questions, the same financial analysis, and the same objective standards. When Pierce Development's expansion plan finally appeared on the screen, the atmosphere inside the conference room became noticeably quieter. Nathaniel sat perfectly still while analysts summarized projected returns, construction timelines, environmental assessments, and financing structures. Nobody mentioned the divorce. Nobody referred to the funeral. They examined numbers instead of emotions. When the presentation concluded, Daniel Harrison looked toward Eleanor. Madam Chair, the recommendation committee has completed its independent review. Eleanor nodded. Please proceed. A senior investment director adjusted his glasses before reading the report. The project demonstrates long-term potential. However, the current debt structure creates unnecessary risk. Our recommendation is conditional approval provided Pierce Development accepts revised financing terms that improve employee protections, contractor payment guarantees, and long-term liquidity. Nathaniel immediately recognized what those conditions meant. They would reduce aggressive short-term profits, but significantly strengthen the company's future stability. It was exactly the type of advice experienced investors often requested from responsible executives. It was not a punishment. It was good business. Every eye in the room turned toward Eleanor. With a single vote, she could reject the proposal outright. She could delay it indefinitely. She could quietly force Nathaniel into a financial position from which recovery would become almost impossible. Instead, she looked down once more at the report before speaking. The recommendation is approved exactly as presented. A few pens scratched across legal pads as secretaries recorded the decision. Nathaniel remained silent, almost unable to believe what he had heard. Eleanor had every reason to say no. She had chosen yes. The meeting continued for another hour before the final agenda item concluded. Executives gradually stood, exchanging handshakes and scheduling follow-up discussions. Several board members thanked Eleanor for conducting her first meeting with unusual professionalism. One elderly investor quietly remarked, "Your mother would have been proud today." Eleanor smiled softly. "That means more to me than any financial result." As the conference room slowly emptied, Nathaniel remained behind. For the first time in years, he seemed uncertain how to begin a conversation. Eleanor gathered her folders carefully before noticing him waiting near the window. "May I have a moment?" he asked quietly. She nodded. Daniel and the remaining advisors respectfully stepped outside, closing the doors behind them. Silence filled the room. Nathaniel looked toward the city skyline before finally speaking. "Did you already know?" Eleanor answered honestly. "Not until after my mother's funeral." He lowered his eyes. "Then everything I believed about that day was wrong." Eleanor did not argue. There was nothing left to prove. Nathaniel took a slow breath. "When I received the invitation to this meeting, I thought you had found a way to embarrass me publicly." Eleanor shook her head. "If I wanted revenge, I would have made today's meeting about our marriage. Instead, it was about responsibility." Nathaniel gave a faint, almost bitter smile. "You could have destroyed my company." "No," Eleanor replied calmly. "Your company employs hundreds of families. Their future should never depend on my disappointment." Those words lingered between them far longer than either expected. Nathaniel realized the greatest difference between them had never been money. It had been perspective. He had viewed success as something to protect for himself. Eleanor viewed it as something to protect for everyone connected to it. Before leaving, she paused beside the conference table where the unsigned divorce documents still rested inside her briefcase. "Our attorneys will finish the legal process professionally," she said. "I hope, for our daughter's sake, we can also finish it with respect." Nathaniel slowly nodded. He watched Eleanor walk toward the elevator, surrounded not by security guards or displays of wealth, but by colleagues who trusted her judgment because she had earned it in a single morning. Only after the elevator doors quietly closed did Nathaniel finally understand the lesson his own success had hidden from him for years. The richest person in the building had never needed anyone else to feel small in order to stand tall. 6 months later, the first snowfall of the season drifted quietly across Hartford as Eleanor stood in the lobby of the newly opened Margaret Brooks Family Center for Children. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting across polished stone floors where families, nurses, teachers, and community volunteers gathered for the dedication ceremony. A bronze plaque near the entrance carried only a simple inscription: "Built with compassion, sustained by hope." There was no mention of the trust value. No list of business achievements. Only the principles Margaret Brooks had spent a lifetime living. Eleanor adjusted the small blanket wrapped around her newborn daughter, Lily Brooks Pierce, who slept peacefully in her arms, completely unaware that she had already become the quiet bridge between two lives that had once seemed impossible to reconcile. The months following the board meeting had changed many things. The divorce had been finalized without public arguments or sensational headlines. Pierce Development accepted the revised financing structure, completed its restructuring, and slowly regained the confidence of investors through transparency rather than aggressive expansion. The company grew more carefully than before, but it also became stronger. Employee retention reached record levels, contractor payments became more reliable, and new affordable housing initiatives earned recognition across the state. Nathaniel had learned that sustainable success required patience far more than pride. He arrived at the ceremony a few minutes before it began, dressed simply in a charcoal overcoat instead of the designer suits that once defined him. There were no cameras waiting for him and no reporters asking difficult questions. He quietly walked toward Eleanor, stopping several feet away before speaking. "She looks just like you." Eleanor smiled as Lily opened her tiny eyes for only a moment before falling asleep again. "She has your determination," Eleanor answered gently. Nathaniel laughed softly, perhaps for the first time in many months. "I hope she inherits your judgment instead." Neither of them mentioned the funeral. Neither spoke about the inheritance or the boardroom. Some chapters no longer needed to be reopened once their lessons had been learned. The ceremony began with local children singing while community leaders thanked the anonymous donors who had supported healthcare and education programs long before anyone knew the Brooks family name. Daniel Harrison stepped to the podium and read one final message Margaret Brooks had written years before. "If my family ever becomes known, let it be because someone slept safely, learned freely, or received kindness when they expected none." The audience rose in quiet applause. Eleanor looked upward for a brief moment, feeling as though her mother had somehow remained present in every life now touched by that generosity. After the ceremony ended, Nathaniel approached Daniel privately. "There is something I have wanted to ask for months," he admitted. "Did Margaret know what I would become?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "No. She simply hoped that one day you would discover who you could become instead." Nathaniel stood silently with those words long after Daniel walked away. Sometimes the hardest truth was realizing that another person had offered grace long before you believed you deserved it. As afternoon sunlight settled over the new building, Eleanor carried Lily outside and paused beside a young maple tree planted in Margaret's memory. Snowflakes rested gently across its bare branches, promising another season would eventually arrive. Nathaniel joined them quietly, and together they watched families enter the center one after another, each carrying hopes of their own. No victory speeches were necessary. No one had truly won by making another person lose. The greatest inheritance Eleanor received had never been $900 million. It had been the wisdom to prove that dignity could outlast disappointment, compassion could outgrow resentment, and character remained the only fortune that increased every time it was shared. Some people spend their entire lives chasing wealth, only to discover too late that money can build buildings but never a reputation. Others inherit responsibility, choose integrity when revenge feels easier, and leave behind something that no balance sheet can ever measure. In the end, fortunes change hands, companies rise and fall, and headlines disappear, but the quiet value of a person's character becomes the only legacy that truly survives.